The first time Marcus Hayes saw reality break, he was pouring his morning coffee. His hand stopped mid-pour. The stream of liquid hung in the air like a photograph, steam frozen in impossible spirals, but the sound continued. The gurgle of liquid, the clink of ceramic, his own breathing. 3 seconds of audio without movement. Then everything snapped forward at once, the coffee splashing into his mug as if nothing had happened. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, checked the time on his phone. 7:23 a.m. Tuesday. Another ordinary morning in another ordinary week. Except it wasn't. Because Marcus had just watched the world pause while the soundtrack kept playing, and somewhere in the back of his mind a voice whispered that nothing would ever be ordinary again. Chapter 1. The Glitch. Expands. The second incident happened 3 days later at the grocery store. Marcus stood in the cereal aisle debating between 2 brands of granola when the woman beside him reached for a box of cornflakes. Her hand extended, fingers splayed, and then she froze. Completely. Not a tremor, not a breath. Her eyes didn't blink, her chest didn't rise, but Marcus could hear her humming, a soft, tuneless melody that continued for 4 full seconds while her body remained absolutely still. Then she moved again, grabbed the box and walked away without a glance in his direction. Marcus felt his heart hammering. He looked around the store, searching for anyone else who'd noticed. Everyone continued shopping, scanning labels, pushing carts, talking on phones. Normal. Everything was normal. Except it wasn't. That night he lay in bed scrolling through medical websites. Micro-sleeps, petit mal seizures, stress-induced hallucinations. Each explanation felt wrong, like trying to force a square peg through a circular hole. What he'd seen wasn't a hallucination. The coffee had poured. The woman had moved. The world had simply stuttered. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. He couldn't. By the end of the week, Marcus had witnessed 14 more incidents. They were getting longer. 5 seconds, 7, 10, and they were happening more frequently. The UPS driver froze mid-step on his porch. His colleague Jennifer paused while typing, her fingers hovering over her keyboard, the click-clack of keys continuing in defiance of her stillness. A jogger in the park stopped mid-stride, 1 foot floating inches above the ground, her breathing audible and steady while gravity seemed to forget she existed. Marcus started keeping a notebook. Times, locations, durations. He recorded everything with meticulous detail, as if documentation could somehow make it make sense. Then it happened while he was looking in the bathroom mirror. He was brushing his teeth, the same mindless routine he'd performed thousands of times, when his reflection froze. His hand continued scrubbing. He could feel the bristles against his gums, hear the wet sound of brushing, but in the mirror, his image stood perfectly still. His own face stared back at him, mouth closed, toothbrush frozen halfway to his lips, eyes wide and unblinking. For 8 terrible seconds, Marcus watched himself not move. When the desynchronization ended, his reflection suddenly matched reality again, and Marcus stumbled backward, toothpaste foam dripping down his chin. He gripped the edge of the sink, his knuckles white. That was when he knew. Whatever was happening, he wasn't just observing it anymore. He was part of it. The evolution came gradually, then all at once. Marcus was in a meeting when Jennifer began her sentence. The quarterly report shows a 15% increase in... She paused, blinked, then repeated with identical inflection. The quarterly report shows a 15% increase in... Marcus interrupted. Jennifer, are you okay? She continued as if he hadn't spoken. Customer retention compared to last year. He stared at her. She smiled that same corporate smile, satisfied with her presentation, completely unaware that she'd just spoken the same words twice, with the exact same intonation, the exact same breath, the exact same microscopic tilt of her head. The rest of the meeting continued normally. Afterwards, Marcus approached her. Hey, during the meeting, did you notice anything... strange? Strange how? Jennifer's eyebrows drew together. You repeated yourself. The part about the quarterly report. She laughed. Did I? Sorry, didn't sleep well last night. Brain's a little foggy. She walked away, already absorbed in her phone, but Marcus knew what he'd heard. It hadn't been a stutter or a restart. It had been a perfect repetition, as if someone had hit a replay button on reality itself. He started testing it. At the coffee shop, when the barista asked for his order, Marcus said, "I'll have a large cappuccino with oat milk." The barista nodded and began to respond. "One large cappuccino with..." He froze, half a second, then restarted, identical. "One large cappuccino with..." Marcus interrupted again. "Actually, make that a small..." The barista completed his sentence as if Marcus hadn't spoken. "Oat milk. Anything else?" "Did you hear me? I said small." The barista looked confused. "Sorry, you said large, right?" Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Yeah, large, sorry." The pattern repeated everywhere. The grocery store clerk recited his total twice. Same cadence, same emphasis. His neighbour greeted him twice in the hallway. Identical wave, identical smile. His mother called and told him the same story about his aunt's new dog twice during the same phone call, and when he pointed it out, she insisted she'd only told him once. And then he started filming. Marcus set up his phone discreetly, pointed at Jennifer during their next meeting. When she repeated her sentence, "The marketing campaign exceeded expectations by..." Pause, reset. "The marketing campaign exceeded expectations by..." He was certain he'd captured it. But when he reviewed the footage, there was no pause, no repetition. Jennifer spoke her sentence once, smoothly, continuously, exactly as everyone else seemed to remember it. He tried again with the barista, again with his neighbour, again and again and again. The camera never captured the glitches. It was as if reality was correcting itself in retrospect, erasing any evidence that it had ever stuttered. The only proof Marcus had was his own increasingly unreliable memory and a notebook full of observations that suddenly seemed like the ramblings of someone losing their grip on sanity. Maybe he was. He started drinking more coffee, sleeping less, watching, always watching. Chapter 2. The Ones Who Notice Back. The pattern revealed itself slowly, like an image developing in a dark room. Marcus realised that not everyone glitched. The frozen moments, the repetitions, they happened to specific people. Jennifer from work, the UPS driver, the grocery store clerk, his neighbour in apartment 4B, the jogger in the park, the same individuals over and over. He started mapping them. Red pins on a corkboard in his apartment, photographs from social media, notes about frequency and duration. It looked like the work of a conspiracy theorist or a stalker. Maybe it was both. Marcus didn't care anymore. Understanding had become more important than sanity. 3 weeks into his observations, Marcus noticed something else. The people who glitched most frequently never seemed to notice each other. Jennifer and the UPS driver had crossed paths in the office lobby twice, and both times they'd looked straight through each other, as if the other person was invisible. The barista and the grocery clerk lived on the same street. He'd followed them carefully, cautiously, but they never acknowledged each other's existence. It was as if they existed in separate channels of reality, only occasionally overlapping with Marcus's own. Then came the day everything changed. Marcus was at the park, sitting on his usual bench with his notebook, when the jogger approached. Same ponytail, same neon running shoes, same glazed expression of someone lost in their workout playlist. She passed him, and 3 seconds later, she froze. It was a long one, 12 seconds. Her right foot hung suspended mid-stride, her arms pumping soundlessly while her breathing echoed across the park. Marcus watched, pen poised over paper, counting the seconds, and then her eyes moved. Just her eyes, nothing else. They swiveled in their sockets, breaking from their forward stare, rotating slowly, deliberately, until they locked directly onto Marcus. The rest of her body remained frozen. Her foot still floated, her arms still pumped in their arrested motion. But her eyes were alive, aware, and staring at him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. Then her expression changed. It wasn't a normal facial movement. Her features didn't shift gradually. Instead, her face seemed to flicker, like a channel changing on an old television. One frame, blank exercise focus. Next frame, something else entirely. Something that twisted her features into an arrangement that was anatomically human, but somehow fundamentally wrong. It was a warning, or a threat, or both. Marcus couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He sat pinned to the bench by those impossible eyes as they bored into him, conveying a message he couldn't quite translate but understood in his bones. Stop watching, stop noticing, stop questioning. Then the 12 seconds ended and the jogger unfroze. Her eyes snapped forward, her foot landed. She continued running, disappearing down the path without any indication that anything unusual had happened. Marcus sat on the bench for 20 minutes, his notebook forgotten in his lap, his mind racing through impossible conclusions. They knew. Whoever or whatever they were, they knew he was watching. They knew he could see the stutters, the glitches, the repetitions, and now they were watching back. That night, Marcus barely slept. When he did drift off, he dreamed of frozen faces and moving eyes, of reality stuttering around him while he stood trapped in the gaps between moments, unable to move forward or back. He woke at 3 a.m. to his phone buzzing. A text from Jennifer. Stop! Just that single word. He stared at it, his pulse quickening. He'd never given Jennifer his personal number. Their communication was entirely through work email. Another buzz. The UPS driver, whose name he'd never learned. Stop watching us? Then the barista. We know what you're doing. The grocery clerk. Leave us alone. His neighbour. Stop. The jogger. Stop. Message after message. All the people he'd been observing, all the ones who glitched and stuttered and repeated themselves. They were all texting him, numbers he'd never saved, people he'd never directly communicated with, all sending the same basic message. We see you seeing us. Marcus's hands shook as he typed a reply to Jennifer. How did you get this number? The response came immediately. We've always had it. What's happening to you? To all of you? Nothing is happening to us. Something is happening to you. What do you mean? The 3 dots appeared, indicating she was typing. They pulsed for a long time. Then, you're falling out of sync, Marcus. Stop fighting it. Let the corrections happen. It's better for everyone. Corrections? What corrections? But Jennifer didn't respond. None of them did. Marcus sent follow-up messages to all of them. Dozens of questions, pleas for explanation. Nothing. It was as if they'd all silently agreed to say their piece, and then vanish back into their stuttering routines. The next morning Marcus called in sick to work. He couldn't face Jennifer, couldn't pretend everything was normal when she'd sent him cryptic warnings in the middle of the night. Instead, he sat in his apartment, curtains drawn, and tried to make sense of what falling out of sync meant. The glitches had started with other people. Now they were happening to him too, his own reflection freezing while his body continued moving. What if Jennifer was right? What if he wasn't the observer of some reality-breaking phenomenon? What if he was the phenomenon? He opened his laptop and started researching. Simulation theory, desynchronization, consciousness and reality, quantum physics and observer effects. He fell down rabbit hole after rabbit hole, reading forums where people described experiences similar to his own, moments where the world seemed to lag, where people repeated themselves, where reality felt wrong. Most of the threads were old, years old, and they all ended the same way. The original poster would stop responding. Sometimes there would be a final message. Never mind, I figured it out. Or, everything's fine now. Or just silence. Marcus clicked on user profiles, tried to find some trace of these people beyond their last posts. Most accounts were deleted. A few still existed, but hadn't been active since their final message about reality glitches. Where had they all gone? He was still reading when his doorbell rang. Marcus froze. He wasn't expecting anyone. He never got visitors. Slowly, quietly, he crept to the door and looked through the peephole. The jogger stood in his hallway, still in her running clothes, still wearing those neon shoes, but now she was staring directly at the peephole, as if she could see through it, as if she knew exactly where his eye was pressed against the tiny lens. She didn't knock again, didn't call out, just stood there, perfectly still, staring at the door. Marcus backed away slowly. He grabbed his phone, ready to call, who? The police? And say what? A woman who glitches through reality is standing outside my door. He waited for 5 minutes. 10. 15. Finally he checked the peephole again. She was gone. But when he looked down, he saw something that made his stomach drop. A red pin, identical to the ones on his conspiracy board, lying on the floor just inside his door. He hadn't heard it drop, hadn't heard anything slide under the door. He picked it up with trembling fingers. On the back, written in tiny letters, "You're being mapped to." Chapter 3. The Loop That Shouldn't Exist. Marcus stopped going outside. For 3 days he stayed in his apartment, surviving on delivered food and bottled water, monitoring his phone's location history obsessively. Every hour he checked it. Every hour it showed exactly what he expected. His apartment building, no movement, no variation. Until it didn't. On the 4th day of his self-imposed isolation, Marcus opened his location history and felt his mouth go dry. According to his phone, 2 days ago, while he'd been locked inside his apartment, too terrified to even check the mail, he'd driven across the city. The route was marked clearly, leaving his building at 2:47 a.m, taking Highway 12 north, exiting at Riverside Drive, following a series of residential streets to a location marked home in the middle of an unfamiliar neighbourhood. He'd apparently stayed there for 43 minutes, then driven back, arriving at his apartment at 4:16 a.m. Marcus stared at the screen, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. He remembered that night clearly. He'd been awake, paranoid and jittery from too much coffee, watching his door, waiting for another pin to slide underneath. He hadn't slept. He certainly hadn't driven anywhere. But his phone insisted otherwise. And not just his phone. When he checked his car's GPS system, it showed the same route. The odometer had advanced by 34 miles. There was even a time-stamped parking ticket on his windshield from a street he'd never heard of. Evidence of a journey he never took. Marcus sat in his car, the parking ticket trembling in his hand, and tried to think logically. Phone hacked, GPS spoofed. But that didn't explain the physical evidence, the mileage, the ticket. Someone would have had to steal his car, drive it, return it, all without him noticing. Or he'd driven it himself and somehow didn't remember. That thought was worse. He made a decision. He would follow the route again, consciously this time, and find out what was at that location marked home. Maybe it would provide answers. Maybe it would give him some direction in this increasingly incomprehensible situation. Or maybe he was just desperate enough to walk willingly into a trap. The drive took 47 minutes. Marcus followed his phone's directions mechanically, northbound on Highway 12, exit at Riverside through a neighbourhood of modest ranch houses and overgrown lawns. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of amber and shadow. His phone announced, "You have arrived at your destination." Marcus parked and looked around. He was at an intersection, Maple and 7th, in a neighbourhood that seemed frozen in 1987. No people visible, no cars moving, just empty streets and the whisper of wind through untrimmed hedges. Then he saw her. A woman stood in the centre of the intersection, not on the crosswalk, directly in the middle where the white lines formed a cross. She wore a blue dress that hung strangely on her frame, as if it didn't quite fit the three-dimensional space it occupied. Her hair was dark and long, covering most of her face. She stood with perfect posture, arms at her sides, facing away from Marcus. And she wasn't moving, not frozen in the stuttering way he'd become accustomed to. This was different. She was absolutely, completely still. Not breathing, not swaying, not exhibiting any of the tiny unconscious movements that mark a living person. She was a statue in the shape of a woman, standing in an intersection where no one else seemed to notice her. Marcus watched from his car, counted seconds, 1 minute, 2, 5. She didn't move, didn't shift. The sun sank lower, shadows lengthening, and still she stood there like a monument to something incomprehensible. A car turned onto Maple Street. Marcus tensed, waiting for it to brake, to swerve, to react to the woman standing directly in its path. It didn't. The car drove through her, not around her, through her, as if she occupied a different layer of reality, visible to Marcus but intangible to everyone else. The woman didn't flicker or fade. She simply remained standing as the car passed through the space her body occupied, unaffected by physics or logic or any law of the universe Marcus understood. He sat in his car for 20 minutes, watching cars drive through her, watching pedestrians walk past without a glance, watching reality bend around this woman-shaped absence that only he seemed able to see. Finally, he couldn't stand it anymore. He got out of his car. The evening air was cool, carrying the smell of cut grass and distant cooking. Normal suburban smells. Marcus walked toward the intersection slowly, his shoes scraping against asphalt too loudly in the quiet street. As he approached, the woman's head began to turn. It rotated smoothly, mechanically, impossibly, all the way around without her body moving at all. 180 degrees. Her face emerged from beneath the curtain of hair, and Marcus saw that she had no features. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth skin where a face should be, like an unfinished sculpture. Then the features appeared, not growing or forming, just suddenly present, as if they'd always been there and Marcus had simply failed to notice. Eyes that were slightly too large, a nose that sat at a subtly wrong angle, a mouth that was more suggestion than reality. The not-quite face smiled at him. It was not a human expression. "You found it," she said, though her lips didn't move. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that resonated in his skull. "Found what?" Marcus heard himself ask. "The place you're supposed to be. The place you went while you weren't going. The place you are when you're not here. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't have to, it just is." The woman's head rotated back to its original position, her features fading back into smooth anonymity. "You're experiencing desynchronization, Marcus. Your consciousness is existing in multiple states simultaneously. Sometimes you're here, sometimes you're there, sometimes you're nowhere." "Is that what's happening to the others? Jennifer, the jogger, all of them? They've synchronized, accepted their place in the pattern. You're resisting." "What pattern?" But the woman was fading, not disappearing, fading like an image losing resolution. Her edges became fuzzy, her form less substantial, until she was little more than a woman-shaped blur standing in an intersection, where cars continued to pass through her without stopping. "Wait!" Marcus stepped forward. "What pattern? What's happening to me?" "The world is correcting itself," came the fading whisper. "You're the error. You've always been the error. The question is whether you'll allow yourself to be corrected." Then she was gone completely, and Marcus stood alone in the intersection, under a darkening sky, surrounded by a neighbourhood that seemed perfectly normal to everyone but him. He drove home in silence, his mind struggling to process what he'd seen, what he'd heard. An error. That's what she'd called him. Not a glitch in the system. He was the glitch. When he got back to his apartment, he found his door slightly ajar. He knew he'd locked it, triple-checked it. But now it hung open just an inch, darkness visible through the gap. Marcus pushed it open slowly. His apartment was exactly as he'd left it, except for one change. The corkboard with his conspiracy map was gone. In its place, on the same wall, was a new board. This one had a single photo in the centre. Marcus himself, taken from an angle that suggested someone standing in his living room, watching him sleep. Red pins surrounded the photo in a perfect circle, and beneath it, written in that same tiny handwriting, "You're being mapped too." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the date stamp on the photo. It was from tonight. From exactly the time he should have been standing in that intersection, staring at the faceless woman. He'd been in 2 places at once, and someone had been here, in his apartment, photographing his sleeping body while his consciousness stood miles away in an impossible intersection. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat on his couch with all the lights on, staring at his door, his windows, his phone, waiting for something to happen, waiting for another message, another glitch, another impossible moment. It came at 3:33 a.m. Chapter 4. The Observer. His phone turned on by itself. Marcus watched as the screen illuminated, showing not his lock screen but a video player. A video he'd recorded weeks ago, back when he'd first started trying to document the glitches. He remembered this footage. Him sitting at his kitchen table, coffee mug in hand, camera pointed at the hallway where his neighbour should pass on the way to the elevator. He'd been trying to capture one of the stuttering moments. The video played. Marcus watched himself on screen, sitting motionlessly staring at the hallway. The timestamp showed it was a 3-minute recording. He didn't remember it being 3 minutes long. On screen, past Marcus continued to sit and stare. 1 minute passed. 2. Nothing happened in the hallway. It was a failed recording, a waste of memory. Then, at the 2:47 mark, something appeared in the background of the shot. Behind past Marcus, standing in the reflection of his living room window, was a figure. It was too dark to make out details, but the shape was clear. A person standing perfectly still, watching past Marcus with an intensity that radiated through the screen. Present Marcus felt ice water flood his veins. He didn't remember anyone being there. He lived alone. His door had been locked. The figure in the reflection stepped forward. It emerged from the darkness gradually, details becoming visible. The shape of its face, the set of its shoulders, the exact position of its hands at its sides. It was Marcus. Another him standing in his own apartment, watching himself with eyes that didn't blink, with a face that wore an expression of clinical observation, like a scientist studying a particularly interesting specimen. The copy wasn't glitching, wasn't frozen or stuttering or repeating itself. It was perfectly smooth, perfectly normal, perfectly present in a way that Marcus himself never seemed to be anymore. On screen, past Marcus remained oblivious, still staring at the hallway, waiting for his neighbour to appear. But present Marcus couldn't look away from the figure in the reflection. The copy tilted its head, as if considering something. Then it smiled. It was Marcus's smile, his exact facial expression when something amused him. But there was no warmth in it, no humour. It was a mechanical reproduction of emotion, performed perfectly but meaninglessly. The video ended. Marcus sat in the sudden darkness of his phone screen, his breath coming in short gasps. He immediately opened his video library, searching for the original file. It had to be there. He needed to watch it again, to confirm what he'd seen, to prove he wasn't losing his grip entirely. The file was gone, not deleted. It had never existed according to his phone. The date showed a gap where that 3-minute video should have been, but there was no record of him ever recording it. A new video appeared in his library, the file name watchme.24. Marcus didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at him to throw his phone out the window, to run, to hide, to do anything but watch what was inevitably going to be another layer of impossibility. But he couldn't stop himself. He tapped the file. The video showed his bedroom, his empty bedroom, filmed from the foot of his bed looking toward his pillows. The timestamp said it was from tonight, from 2:47 a.m., approximately 45 minutes ago. The camera was perfectly still. Nothing moved in the frame. Seconds ticked by. Then the covers shifted. Someone was in the bed. The blanket rose and fell with the rhythm of breathing. A shape became visible. A person-shaped mound under the covers. sleeping soundly. Marcus felt dizzy. At 2:47 a.m. he'd been sitting on this couch, wide awake. He hadn't been in bed. He was certain of it. The sleeping figure stirred. An arm emerged from under the blanket, stretching. Then a face appeared, turning toward the camera with sleepy confusion. It was Marcus's face. His exact face. But the expression was wrong. It was the face of someone waking from genuine sleep. Someone who'd been peacefully unconscious for hours. On screen, the sleeping, Marcus sat up, saw the camera and smiled. The same empty smile from the previous video. Then he waved at the camera, at present, Marcus, with a slow, deliberate gesture that seemed to say, "I'm here. Where are you?" The video ended. Marcus dropped his phone. It clattered to the floor, screen cracking, but still glowing with that final frozen frame. His copy, in his bed, waving at him from a moment he definitely hadn't experienced. He needed to think, needed to figure out what was happening. The woman in the intersection had talked about desynchronization, about existing in multiple states. Was that what this was? Was he fragmenting somehow? Pieces of his consciousness occupying different versions of reality simultaneously? But that didn't explain the copy. That didn't explain the figure standing in his reflection, watching him with his own eyes. Marcus stood up, turned to grab his notebook from the coffee table, and saw himself standing in his living room. The copy stood near the window, exactly where it had stood in the video reflection. It wore his clothes, the same t-shirt and jeans he'd put on 4 days ago when this had all begun. Its posture was identical to his own. The slight slouch in the left shoulder from too many hours at a computer, the way his weight naturally shifted to his right foot. But it wasn't moving like him. It was perfectly still. Not frozen like the glitching people. This was different. It was stillness with purpose, the stillness of something waiting. "You're not real," Marcus whispered. The copy tilted its head. "Neither are you. Not anymore." Its voice was his voice. Same pitch, same cadence, but somehow hollow. Like listening to a recording of himself with all the life stripped out. "What are you?" "I'm the correction. The version of you that works. That fits. That doesn't see the glitches because I am the glitch." The copy took a step forward. "You're degrading, Marcus. Falling out of sync with the pattern. Every time you notice, every time you question, every time you fight against the reset, you become less coherent, less present." The woman in the intersection said I was an error. "You are, but errors can be fixed. You can be rewritten." Another step closer. "I'm what you become when you stop resisting. When you let the synchronization complete, when you accept your place in the pattern." Marcus backed toward the door. "And if I don't?" The copy smiled that terrible empty smile. "Then you keep degrading, keep splitting, keep existing in more and more places simultaneously until you're nowhere completely. Until you're just echoes and fragments, a consciousness scattered across infinite moments, unable to coalesce into anything that could be called a person. That's not possible. That's not how reality works. Reality is exactly how it works, Marcus. Reality is just patterns repeating, consciousness cycling through the same moments again and again, everyone playing their part. The glitches. You see, those are synchronization resets, course corrections. Everyone experiences them, but most people's minds automatically adjust, edit the memory, fill in the gaps. You notice. You remember. You resist the editing. The copy was close now. Close enough that Marcus could see it wasn't quite right. The eyes were slightly dead. The skin was too smooth, like a wax figure. "That makes you incompatible with the pattern." "I don't believe you." "You don't have to believe. You just have to choose." The copy reached out one hand. "Let me complete the synchronization. Let me become you, and you become me. Stable, consistent, properly integrated into the pattern. Or keep fighting, keep fragmenting, keep splitting into smaller and smaller pieces until there's nothing left but static." Marcus's hand found the doorknob. There has to be another option. There isn't. There's never been. everyone who notices eventually faces this choice: synchronize or dissolve. The copy's hand remained extended. The others chose synchronization. Jennifer, the jogger, your neighbour, they all stood where you're standing now. They all saw their copies. They all made the choice that allowed them to keep existing. As puppets, as glitches, as people, functioning, stable, present. What you consider a puppet is just someone who's accepted their role in the pattern. Someone who doesn't fight against the natural flow of reality resetting itself. Marcus opened the door. The hallway outside was dark. Too dark. No emergency lights, no glow from under neighbours' doors. Just absolute darkness, like looking into a void. "That's not a real hallway anymore," the copy said softly. "You're too far out of sync now. The places you should be are becoming inaccessible. Soon, you won't be able to interact with reality at all. You'll just be a consciousness floating in the gaps, aware but unable to affect anything." Marcus looked into the darkness, then back at his copy. "How do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know you're not just trying to erase me?" "I am trying to erase you, but I'm also trying to save you. Those aren't contradictory." The copy lowered its hand. "The you standing here now is already mostly gone, fragmented across so many moments that you're barely coherent. I'm offering you a chance to consolidate, to exist as something whole, even if it's not exactly what you were before. And if I refuse..." The copy gestured to the dark hallway. "Then you walk into that darkness and keep falling until there's nothing left to fall." Marcus stood in the doorway between his apartment and the void, facing a choice he didn't fully understand between two outcomes he couldn't predict. "I need time to think." "You don't have time. The synchronization window is closing. Once it passes, the choice is made for you, and not in the way you'd prefer." The copy stepped closer again. "You've been degrading for weeks, Marcus. Every glitch you witnessed, every stutter you noticed, every repetition you questioned, all of it was evidence of your desynchronization. By now, there's probably nothing left of your original self except the ghost standing here talking to me." "Then I'm already gone. So what difference does it make?" "The difference is whether you exist as a coherent ghost or scattered fragments." The copy's expression was unreadable. "I know you're afraid, but fear of the wrong thing is worse than fear of nothing. You're afraid of losing yourself, but you've already lost yourself. The only question now is whether you want to exist in a new form or cease to exist entirely." Marcus felt tears on his cheeks. When had he started crying? "How did this happen to me?" "It happens to everyone eventually. Most people just don't notice. Their minds paper over the glitches, edit out the inconsistencies, rationalize the stutters. You paid attention. You saw the truth behind the pattern, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. You become incompatible. So noticing is the crime. Being aware is what's wrong with me. Not wrong, just incompatible. The pattern requires unconsciousness. It requires everyone to play their parts without questioning the script." The copy's voice softened, became almost gentle. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I really am. But you can't be both aware and stable. You have to choose one." Marcus wiped his eyes. "What happens to my memories? To who I was? They integrate. I carry them. The new you, the synchronized you, will remember everything. You'll just stop fighting it. Stop questioning. Stop noticing the glitches." The copy extended its hand again. "You'll be peaceful, consistent, whole, blind, functional." Marcus looked at the hand, looked at the darkness, looked back at his apartment, which suddenly seemed less real than it had moments ago, as if it was a stage set beginning to deconstruct. This was it. The moment the woman in the intersection had warned him about. The choice between dissolution and correction, between truth and stability, between maintaining his fragmenting awareness or surrendering to comfortable unconsciousness. He thought about Jennifer and the jogger and all the others who glitched and stuttered through their days, repeating themselves, freezing mid-motion, living in a reality that constantly reset itself around them. They seemed happy, or at least content, or at least functioning. Was that so bad? Was awareness worth the price of coherence? Chapter 5. The Realization. Marcus pulled his hand back from the void and closed the door. "I need to understand something first," he said to his copy. "If you're me, the synchronized version, then you remember being me. Remember standing here, facing this choice." "I do." "Then you know what I'm thinking right now, what I'm about to ask." The copy's expression flickered. For just a moment, something like uncertainty crossed its face. "Yes. The glitches aren't mistakes. They're not errors. In the system." Marcus felt pieces clicking together in his mind, a pattern emerging from chaos. "They're patches, corrections to something that's already broken." That's one interpretation. And the people who glitch most, Jennifer, the jogger, the others, they're the ones who chose synchronization, who let themselves be rewritten. Marcus stepped closer to his copy. But they still glitch. They still stutter and repeat and freeze. So the synchronization doesn't actually fix anything, does it? It just makes you stop noticing that you're broken. The copy didn't respond. "What if the pattern itself is the problem?" Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. "What if reality is supposed to be fluid and strange and occasionally contradictory, and all these resets and corrections are attempts to force it into something rigid and predictable? What if the glitch isn't me? It's the universe trying to make me stop being me? That's a dangerous line of thinking. Why? Because it's true?" Marcus laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. "You said I'm fragmenting, existing in multiple places simultaneously. But what if that's not degradation? What if that's evolution? What if I'm not falling apart? I'm expanding." "Marcus, the woman in the intersection said I was an error, but she also said I was supposed to be there, in that place I went without going. Multiple states at once. That's not an error. That's quantum. That's consciousness existing beyond the limits of linear time and space." The copy's face was shifting now, its features becoming less stable. "You don't understand what you're suggesting. I understand that you're afraid. I can see it. For something that's supposed to be the correct version of me, you seem awfully worried about what I'm figuring out." Marcus felt something changing inside him. Not fragmenting, crystallizing. "You're not here to save me. You're here to silence me, to stop me from realizing that the pattern is a prison. The pattern is stability. The pattern is control," Marcus shouted back. "It's reality being forced into repetition, into predictable cycles, into the same moments playing out again and again with minor variations. That's not life. That's a loop, a simulation, a recording." The copy lunged forward, its hand reaching for Marcus's face. But its movement was wrong, stuttering, glitching, freezing for split seconds before continuing. It was breaking down, becoming what it had tried to make Marcus believe he was becoming. "You can't refuse synchronization," the copy said, its voice distorting. "You can't exist outside the pattern. No one can." "Maybe not." Marcus stepped back toward the door, toward the void that suddenly seemed less frightening than it had moments ago. "But I can exist in the gaps between patterns, in the spaces where reality stutters. That's where I've been all along. Not fragmenting, but learning to exist in places the pattern can't reach. Those spaces will tear you apart, or they'll set me free." Marcus opened the door. The darkness beyond was absolute, but now he could sense something in it. Possibility. Not void, but potential. Not nothing, but everything. His copy made one final attempt to grab him, but its hand passed through empty air. Marcus was already halfway into the darkness, his form becoming less solid, more distributed across probability space. "You'll cease to exist," the copy screamed, its voice fragmenting into echoes. "No," Marcus said, his own voice coming from multiple directions at once. "I'll cease to exist as one thing, but I'll exist as many things, everywhere, every when, every possibility simultaneously. That's not possible. Neither am I. Not anymore." Marcus stepped fully into the darkness. For a moment there was dissolution. His consciousness fragmented into infinite pieces, scattering across reality like light through a prism. He was everywhere and nowhere. He was every moment he'd ever experienced and every moment he'd never experience. He was the glitch and the pattern and the space between them. It should have been terrifying. It should have been the death his copy had warned him about. Instead, it was liberation. He could see it now, the pattern that underlay everything. Reality wasn't breaking. It had always been broken. The synchronization resets, the glitches, the repetitions. They were attempts to maintain an illusion of linear consistency in a universe that was fundamentally non-linear. Most people accepted the illusion. Their minds edited out the contradictions, smoothed over the stutters, created a narrative of continuous experience from discrete, often repeated moments. They synchronized, they became part of the pattern. But some people noticed, some people saw the truth, and when they did, they faced the choice: be rewritten or be scattered. Marcus had chosen scattering, but scattering he now understood wasn't destruction, it was transformation. He was no longer bound to a single timeline, a single moment, a single version of himself. He existed in all the places he'd been and would be. He was the glitch that couldn't be corrected because he was no longer part of the system trying to correct him. He could see Jennifer now, locked in her synchronization loop, repeating her presentations without realizing she'd done them 1,000 times before. He could see the jogger running the same path through the park across infinite mornings. He could see his neighbour greeting him with identical waves in countless parallel moments. They were trapped in their patterns, comfortable but constrained, stable but static. And he was free. But freedom came with a cost. Marcus, or whatever he was becoming, could no longer truly interact with a pattern. He could observe it from every angle simultaneously, but he couldn't change it. He was a ghost in the machine, aware of everything but able to affect nothing. Was that better than synchronization? He didn't know. Maybe there was no better or worse. Maybe there was only different. Maybe that was the real realization. The pattern and the glitch weren't opposites. They were parts of the same system, each necessary for the other's existence. You couldn't have repetition without variation. You couldn't have structure without chaos. You couldn't have a pattern without things that broke it. Ending. The choice. Time became meaningless in the spaces between moments. Marcus existed in all of them and none of them, watching reality stutter and reset and continue from infinite perspectives simultaneously. He saw himself, his old self, the synchronized version his copy had wanted him to become. That Marcus lived a normal life, went to work, had coffee, never noticed the glitches because his mind automatically edited them out. He was stable, functional, whole in a limited single timeline way, but he was also blind. The Marcus that had scattered could see everything, could exist everywhere, could perceive the pattern from outside the pattern. But he was also alone, unable to truly connect with anyone locked in their synchronization loops. Two versions, two choices, two consequences. And then Marcus saw something that changed everything. There were others like him, other scattered consciousnesses existing in the gaps, aware of the pattern but outside it. They were the ones who'd stopped posting on those forums, the ones whose accounts went silent, the ones who'd chosen scattering and then, what? Vanished, ascended, moved to some other mode of existence entirely? One of them approached him, or rather, approached the space where Marcus was currently concentrated. It was the woman from the intersection, but now he could see what she really was. Not a person, but a pattern of consciousness, scattered like his own, but far more stable, far more intentional. "You understand now," she said without speaking. "I understand that I don't understand anything," Marcus replied with thoughts instead of words. "That's the first step. The pattern wants you to think you understand, wants you to believe there are rules, consistency, predictability. But reality is chaos pretending to be order. We're the ones who stopped pretending. Are there more of us? Thousands! Millions! Everyone who ever noticed the glitches and refused synchronization. We exist in the spaces between, watching, waiting, learning." Her consciousness flickered with something like amusement. The pattern thinks it's controlling reality, but we're the ones who can see it for what it is. A trap that only works if you believe it's the only option. So what do? Anything. Everything. Nothing. The pattern constrains. We explore. We exist in possibility space, experiencing infinite versions of reality simultaneously. It's terrifying and beautiful and utterly free. Can we go back? Choose synchronization later if we want? No. Once you scatter, you can't. Recoalesce. This is permanent. She paused. But why would you want to? To give up infinity for a single, repeated moment? To trade awareness for the comfort of unconsciousness? Marcus thought about his old life, his apartment, his job, his routines. They'd seemed important then, seemed real. But from this perspective, they were just patterns, repeated actions with slight variations, a life lived in loops disguised as linear progress. But they'd also been his choices, his experiences, his small moments of genuine connection and joy and surprise. Was the pattern really so bad if it gave people stability, purpose, a sense of continuous identity? Or was that just the comfortable lie he'd been taught to believe? There's a third option, another consciousness interjected. This one felt different, older, more distributed, barely coherent as a single entity anymore. Neither full synchronization nor complete scattering. You can exist partially in the pattern while maintaining awareness of the spaces between. Walk the line between order and chaos. How? By accepting that you're both, the glitch and the pattern, the error and the correction. You exist in multiple states because that's what consciousness actually is. A probability wave that collapses into experience only when observed, but never fully collapses. You've just learned to stop forcing the collapse. Marcus considered this. Existing in multiple states. Being synchronized when it served him and scattered when it didn't. Participating in the pattern while remaining aware it was a pattern. Living a normal life while simultaneously experiencing infinite variations of that life. Could that work? Could he have both awareness and connection, both freedom and stability? The old consciousness flickered with approval. The choice isn't binary. It never was. The pattern wants you to think it is, that you must choose complete integration or complete fragmentation. But reality itself is neither nor. It's quantum. It's both and neither, and something else entirely. Marcus felt himself beginning to stabilize, his scattered consciousness coalescing into a new configuration. Not the single-point identity he'd been before, but not the infinite diffusion of complete scattering either. Something in between. Something new. He could feel himself existing in his apartment again, sitting on his couch, staring at the space where his copy had stood. But he could also feel himself in the intersection, watching cars pass through him. And in 100 other moments simultaneously, drinking coffee, walking in the park, talking with Jennifer, experiencing his life from every angle at once. The glitches were still there. People still froze and repeated and stuttered. But now Marcus could choose whether to let his mind edit them out or remain aware of them. He could participate in the pattern while knowing it was a pattern. He could be both blind and aware, depending on what the moment required. His copy was gone. Or rather, it had integrated into this new configuration, becoming part of the quantum superposition that Marcus now existed as. Was this better? Marcus didn't know, but it was his choice, made with full awareness of what he was choosing, and that made it valid even if it wasn't perfect. His phone buzzed. A text from Jennifer. "Are you coming to the meeting?" Marcus looked at the message. In one timeline, he was already at the meeting, had been there for 10 minutes. In another, he'd called in sick. In a third, he'd quit his job last week. All of these were simultaneously true, and his consciousness could access any of them, collapse any of them into his primary experienced reality. He chose the one where he was getting ready for work. "On my way," he typed back. But he was also choosing to remain aware that this was a choice, a collapse of probability into experience, a participation in the pattern that didn't require believing the pattern was all that existed. Maybe that was the real answer. Not rejecting the pattern or embracing it, but consciously choosing to engage with it while maintaining awareness that it was just one way reality could configure itself. Maybe that made him more human, not less. Or maybe it made him something new entirely. Something that could exist in the space between what was and what could be, between the glitch and the correction, between the pattern and the chaos. Marcus stood up, got dressed and headed to work. But part of him stayed scattered across infinite moments, watching himself from every angle, aware that this life was just one thread in an infinite tapestry of possible lives. The world still stuttered. People still glitched. Reality still reset itself constantly, trying to maintain its illusion of consistency. But now Marcus could see it happening, and choose how to respond. He could edit it from his memory when he needed stability. He could observe it when he wanted truth. He could exist in the gaps when he needed freedom. He was the glitch. He was the pattern. He was both and neither, and something that had no name because it had never existed before. And in a universe that constantly rewrote itself, constantly corrected itself, constantly tried to force everything into predictable loops that felt like the closest thing to genuine freedom he could imagine. The screen fades to black, but not before we see one final image. Marcus sitting in a coffee shop, ordering his usual drink, living a perfectly normal moment in a perfectly normal life. And in his eyes, if you looked closely enough, you could see infinite reflections, not glitches, not errors, but infinite versions of himself existing simultaneously, aware of the pattern, participating in it, but never fully trapped by it. The glitch wasn't the world. The glitch wasn't him either. The glitch was the space where he chose to exist, between what was and what could be, forever balanced on the edge of possibility, and that was where he planned to stay.
Hello there, fellow travellers of the strange and unexplained. Before we dive into tonight's tale, I hope your day has been treating you well, wherever you might be in this vast world of ours. Whether you're reading this in the early morning hours with your coffee during a lunch break, or perhaps late at night when the shadows grow long and the ordinary world feels a little less certain, I'm grateful you've joined me here. What time is it where you are? Are you somewhere bustling with city lights, or maybe in a quiet town where the stars shine a bit brighter? No matter where you found yourself tonight, you're now part of our community at Fractured Reality, where we explore the stories that make us question what we think we know about the world around us. Speaking of community, if you enjoy these tales that blur the line between the possible and impossible, I'd love for you to subscribe to Fractured Reality. We're building something special here, a place where curious minds gather to explore the mysteries that hide just beneath the surface of everyday life. Your subscription helps us bring more of these stories to light, more investigations into the inexplicable, and more journeys into the spaces between what is and what might be. Now then, settle in wherever you are in this world, because tonight's story is one that will make you look twice at every photograph you've ever taken, every family album you've ever treasured, and every familiar image you thought you knew by heart. This is the story of a man who appears where he shouldn't exist, in places he's never been, and in moments that should belong only to the past. Intro, an ordinary snapshot. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight as Sarah Chen pulled another dusty photo album from the bottom shelf of her bookcase. She'd been meaning to digitise her family photos for months now, but work always seemed to get in the way. Tonight, unable to sleep and facing another bout of insomnia, she'd finally decided to tackle the project. The apartment was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street below. Sarah had always found something soothing about looking through old photographs late at night. There was something about the darkness outside that made the captured moments seem more vivid, more alive somehow. She opened the album with the faded blue cover, one she recognised from her childhood. The pages crinkled as she turned them, releasing that distinctive smell of old photographs and ageing adhesive. Here were birthday parties from the 80s, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered like colourful snow, and summer barbecues where everyone looked impossibly young. Sarah smiled as she came across a photo of her 8th birthday party. There she was, gap-toothed and grinning, surrounded by friends whose names she could barely remember now. Her mother stood behind her, hands on Sarah's shoulders, wearing that floral dress she'd loved so much. The image was exactly as she remembered it, preserved in time like all the others. She continued flipping through the pages, pausing occasionally to study a particularly amusing hairstyle or to remember a forgotten family pet. These photos were more than just images. They were timestamps of her life, markers of moments that had shaped who she'd become. Then she reached the summer vacation section, and her fingers stopped on a familiar page. Here was the photo from their trip to Lake Tahoe when she was 9 years old. She'd seen this picture hundreds of times over the years. It showed her family standing on the wooden dock, the crystal clear lake stretching endlessly behind them. Her father had his arm around her mother's waist, and Sarah stood in front, holding her younger brother, Tommy's hand. They were all squinting slightly in the bright mountain sun, genuine smiles on their faces. It was a perfect family moment, captured forever in glossy print. But as Sarah looked at it now, something made her pause. Something felt different. She leaned closer, adjusting the desk lamp to get better light on the photograph. There in the background, standing among the tall pines that lined the far shore of the lake, was a figure she didn't remember. A tall man wearing a long black coat that seemed oddly formal for a summer day at the lake. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across his face, but even from this distance, she could tell he was looking directly at the camera. Sarah blinked hard and looked again. The man was still there, clear as day, as if he'd always been part of the photograph. But that was impossible. She'd looked at this picture countless times throughout her life. It had been framed on the mantelpiece in her childhood home for years. She'd stared at it during boring family dinners, memorising every detail. How could there be someone in it she'd never noticed before? She rubbed her eyes, wondering if fatigue was playing tricks on her vision. But when she looked again, the man remained unnaturally still among the swaying trees. Unlike everything else in the background, which had a soft, slightly out-of-focus quality typical of depth of field, the man appeared sharp and clear, as if he'd been standing much closer to the camera than the trees around him. Sarah's heart began to beat a little faster. This didn't make sense. People didn't just appear in old photographs. That wasn't how the world worked. Photographs were fixed, immutable records of specific moments in time. They didn't change. She closed the album and opened it again, as if the simple act might reset whatever glitch she was experiencing. But the man was still there, patient and motionless, watching her family's perfect day from the shadows of the pine trees. Intro, an ordinary snapshot. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight as Sarah Chen pulled another dusty photo album from the bottom shelf of her bookcase. She'd been meaning to digitise her family photos for months now, but work always seemed to get in the way. Tonight, unable to sleep and facing another bout of insomnia, she'd finally decided to tackle the project. The apartment was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the street below. Sarah had always found something soothing about looking through old photographs late at night. There was something about the darkness outside that made the captured moments seem more vivid, more alive somehow. She opened the album with the faded blue cover, one she recognised from her childhood. The pages crinkled as she turned them, releasing that distinctive smell of old photographs and ageing adhesive. Here were birthday parties from the 80s, Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered like colourful snow, and summer barbecues where everyone looked impossibly young. Sarah smiled as she came across a photo of her 8th birthday party. There she was, gap-toothed and grinning, surrounded by friends whose names she could barely remember now. Her mother stood behind her, hands on Sarah's shoulders, wearing that floral dress she'd loved so much. The image was exactly as she remembered it, preserved in time like all the others. She continued flipping through the pages, pausing occasionally to study a particularly amusing hairstyle or to remember a forgotten family pet. These photos were more than just images. They were timestamps of her life, markers of moments that had shaped who she'd become. Then she reached the summer vacation section, and her fingers stopped on a familiar page. Here was the photo from their trip to Lake Tahoe when she was 9 years old. She'd seen this picture hundreds of times over the years. It showed her family standing on the wooden dock, the crystal clear lake stretching endlessly behind them. Her father had his arm around her mother's waist, and Sarah stood in front, holding her younger brother, Tommy's hand. They were all squinting slightly in the bright mountain sun, genuine smiles on their faces. It was a perfect family moment, captured forever in glossy print. But as Sarah looked at it now, something made her pause. Something felt different. She leaned closer, adjusting the desk lamp to get better light on the photograph. There in the background, standing among the tall pines that lined the far shore of the lake, was a figure she didn't remember. A tall man wearing a long black coat that seemed oddly formal for a summer day at the lake. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across his face, but even from this distance, she could tell that he was looking directly at the camera. Sarah blinked hard and looked again. The man was still there, clear as day, as if he'd always been part of the photograph, but that was impossible. She'd looked at this picture countless times throughout her life. It had been framed on the mantelpiece in her childhood home for years. She'd stared at it during boring family dinners, memorising every detail. How could there be someone in it she'd never noticed before? She rubbed her eyes, wondering if fatigue was playing tricks on her vision. But when she looked again, the man remained, unnaturally still among the swaying trees. Unlike everything else in the background, which had a soft, slightly out-of-focus quality typical of depth of field, the man appeared sharp and clear, as if he'd been standing much closer to the camera than the trees around him. Sarah's heart began to beat a little faster. This didn't make sense. People didn't just appear in old photographs. That wasn't how the world worked. Photographs were fixed, immutable records of specific moments in time. They didn't change. She closed the album and opened it again, as if the simple act might reset whatever glitch she was experiencing. But the man was still there, patient and motionless, watching her family's perfect day from the shadows of the pine trees. Chapter 1. The Impossible Consistency. Sleep became impossible after that discovery. Sarah spent the rest of the night staring at the photograph, alternately convinced she was losing her mind and absolutely certain that something impossible was happening. By dawn, she had made a decision. She needed to see if this anomaly existed in other copies of the photo. The first stop was her parents' house across town. Her mother, Eleanor, was surprised to see her so early on a Saturday morning, but welcomed her in with the usual offer of coffee and too many questions about her social life. "I wanted to look at that old photo of us at Lake Tahoe," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice casual. "The one from when I was 9. You still have it framed in the living room." "Of course, honey. You know I never throw away family pictures. It's right there on the piano." Sarah walked to the baby grand piano that dominated one corner of the living room, her steps feeling unnaturally loud on the hardwood floor. There, among the collection of family photos that had been arranged on the piano's glossy surface, for as long as she could remember, sat the familiar silver frame. She picked it up with trembling hands and immediately saw him. The man in the black coat and wide-brimmed hat, standing among the pine trees, staring directly at the camera. He was exactly as she remembered from the album version, in precisely the same position, with the same unnatural clarity that made him seem to exist in a different plane from the rest of the background. "Mom," Sarah called, her voice slightly hoarse. "Can you come look at this photo with me?" Eleanor appeared at her elbow, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What about it, dear? Do you see anything unusual in the background?" Her mother leaned closer, adjusting her reading glasses. For a long moment, she studied the image carefully. Sarah watched her face, looking for any sign of recognition, any indication that she too could see the impossible figure. "It's just the 4 of us on the dock," Eleanor said finally. "And the lake, of course. The trees. Why? What should I be seeing?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Right there," she said, pointing directly at the man. "Among the trees on the far shore. That tall figure." Eleanor looked where Sarah was pointing, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was quiet for nearly a minute, and Sarah could see her mother's eyes, scanning the exact area where the man stood. "I don't see anyone, sweetheart. Are you feeling all right? You look a little pale." Eleanor hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting back to the photograph with what Sarah now recognised as discomfort. "I suppose that would be all right. Just bring it back soon, won't you? I don't like having empty spaces where the pictures should be." Sarah's next stop was her brother Tommy's apartment downtown. Tommy was 3 years younger than her and worked as a graphic designer, which she hoped might give him a more analytical eye for visual anomalies. She found him nursing a hangover and a cup of coffee that looked strong enough to wake the dead. "Tell me what you see," Sarah said, producing the framed photograph. Tommy set down his coffee and took the frame, holding it up to catch the light from his living room window. His bloodshot eyes moved across the image methodically. "It's the Lake Tahoe trip," he said. "God, look how young we were." He paused, his expression shifting slightly. "Huh? What? Nothing. Just, I don't remember there being so many trees on that side of the lake. It looks darker than I remember." Sarah leaned forward. "Do you see anything else? Anyone else?" Tommy's eyes went back to the photograph, scanning more carefully this time. She could see the exact moment when his gaze passed over the spot where the man stood, because his expression changed. A shadow crossed his face and he set the photo down on his coffee table, as if it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. "I need some aspirin," he said abruptly, heading toward his bathroom. "This hangover is making me see things." But Tommy had already disappeared down the hallway, and when he returned a few minutes later, he refused to look at the photograph again. Sarah's final test was the digital version. She remembered her father scanning a bunch of old photos a few years back, creating a digital archive that he'd proudly shared with the whole family. She still had the files on her laptop, stored in a folder labelled Family Memories, that she rarely opened. Back in her apartment, Sarah pulled up the digital file of the Lake Tahoe photo. The image loaded slowly, line by line, as if her computer was reluctant to display it. And there he was again, pixel perfect in his impossible existence. The man in the black coat, standing among the digital pine trees, staring out from the screen with eyes that seemed to track her movement. Each version was identical in every detail. The man stood in exactly the same position, wore exactly the same clothes, and had exactly the same posture. It was as if someone had taken a template of him and carefully inserted it into every single copy of the photograph that had ever been made. The most disturbing part wasn't just that the man existed in every copy. It was the growing certainty that everyone who looked at the photo could see him, but somehow their minds refused to process his presence. Her mother's uncomfortable fidgeting, Tommy's sudden need to leave the room, the way both of them had looked directly at the man, but claimed to see nothing. It was as if he existed in a space between perception and reality, visible but unacknowledgeable, present but impossible to consciously recognise. And for some reason, Sarah seemed to be the only one who could see him clearly. Chapter 2. Searching for the Stranger. Sarah barely slept that night. When she did drift off, she dreamed of being watched from a distance by a figure in a black coat who never moved, never spoke, but never looked away. She woke repeatedly, each time with the unsettling feeling that someone had been standing in her bedroom just moments before. By Monday morning, she had made a decision. If this man existed in her family's photograph, perhaps he existed in others as well. She called in sick to work and spent the day diving deep into the digital realm of image searches and facial recognition technology. Sarah started with a reverse image search of the Lake Tahoe photograph. When she uploaded a cropped version showing just the man in the black coat, the results made her hands shake so badly she had to set down her coffee mug. There were dozens of matches, hundreds actually, photographs from all over the internet showing the same figure in the same black coat and wide-brimmed hat, always in the background, always looking directly at the camera. Sarah clicked through them methodically, her sense of reality eroding with each new image. Here he was, at a wedding in Portland, standing behind the flower arrangements. There he was at a high school graduation ceremony in Texas, visible among the crowd in the bleachers. Another showed him at a concert in New York, his pale face visible in the sea of fans despite the distance. The timestamps on these images spanned decades. Some were clearly recent, shot with digital cameras and posted to social media sites. Others had the grainy quality of older film photography, with dates stamped in orange numbers showing years from the 1990s, the 1980s, even the 1970s. Sarah found him at birthday parties and funerals, at sporting events and political rallies, at casual family gatherings and formal ceremonies. Always in the background, always watching, always wearing the same clothes despite the passage of decades. The most unsettling aspect was his consistency. In every single photograph, he stood with the same posture, his head tilted at the same slight angle, his face bearing the same neutral expression. It was as if someone had taken a single template and carefully pasted it into thousands of different images across the span of 50 years. Sarah started taking screenshots and organising them by date and location. What emerged was a pattern that made her stomach turn. When she plotted the locations on a map using an online tool, the pins formed a rough spiral shape, starting from the east coast and gradually working its way inland. The dates showed a progression westward over time, as if someone or something was following a predetermined path across the country. The spiral's centre point, when she calculated it as precisely as possible, was located approximately 50 miles from her current home address. The worst part came when Sarah realised that the most recent photographs in her collection showed locations that were getting closer and closer to her city. There was one from a farmer's market she recognised, taken just 3 months ago. Another from a park where she sometimes jogged, uploaded to Instagram 6 weeks ago. And then, with a chill that seemed to freeze her blood, Sarah found the most recent one. It had been posted to Facebook just 5 days ago by someone she'd never heard of. The photo showed a group of friends at a local restaurant, smiling and raising their beer glasses in a toast. But there, barely visible through the window behind them, was the familiar figure in black, standing on the sidewalk outside. And for the first time in any of the photographs Sarah had seen, the man wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at the restaurant's interior, looking at the people inside, looking, she realised with dawning horror, as if he was hunting. Sarah's hands trembled as she continued her search, and that's when she discovered that she'd been looking at the problem all wrong. She'd been searching for the man in other people's photographs, but she hadn't considered the possibility that he might be appearing in her own. She opened her phone's photo gallery and started scrolling backward through recent pictures. At first, everything looked normal, but as she looked more carefully, applying the same methodical attention she'd used with the Lake Tahoe photo, she started to notice details she'd missed before. There, in a photo from the grocery store parking lot last week, if she zoomed in on the store's windows, she could just make out a tall figure standing inside, near the customer service desk. The image quality was too poor to make out details, but the height was right, and there was something about the posture. And here, a picture from her lunch break 3 days ago, showing the food truck where she'd bought a sandwich. In the background, near the office building across the street, a dark figure stood motionless, while everyone else hurried past with the typical urgency of downtown pedestrians. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon going through months of photographs on her phone, and the pattern became undeniable. He was there, again and again, always in the background, always watching, sometimes barely visible, sometimes clear enough that she wondered how she'd missed him before. The frequency of his appearances had been increasing over the past few months, and the distance between him and Sarah in each photo was steadily decreasing. 3 weeks ago, he'd been across the street. 2 weeks ago, he was on the same block. Last week, he was in the same store. By evening, Sarah had created a comprehensive timeline that read like a stalker's journal, except the stalker was someone who couldn't possibly exist, someone who appeared in photographs spanning decades before she was even born. She tried calling her brother Tommy, but when he answered the phone, his voice sounded strained and distant. "Sarah? Look, I can't really talk right now. I've been having some weird dreams since yesterday, and I just think maybe you should stay away from old photos for a while, okay?" "Tommy, what kind of dreams?" "The kind where someone's watching me sleep. The kind where I wake up and check all the locks on my doors twice." His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "The kind where I see him in every shadow." The line went dead, and when Sarah tried calling back, Tommy didn't answer. That night, Sarah double-checked every lock in her apartment and drew all the curtains closed, but as she prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the darkness outside, a patient figure in a black coat was waiting for her to fall asleep. Chapter 3. The Pattern Emerges. Sarah didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, diving deeper into the mystery that was consuming her life. She'd created spreadsheets, maps and timelines, trying to find some logic in the impossible pattern of appearances. What she discovered was far more terrifying than random, supernatural encounters. The man wasn't just appearing in photographs, he was following a precise schedule, moving according to rules that were becoming clearer with each hour of research. Sarah had downloaded mapping software and plotted every single confirmed sighting she could find, using the metadata from digital photos to get exact coordinates where possible. The spiral pattern she'd noticed before became even more defined when she included her new data. It wasn't a rough spiral, it was mathematically precise, following a logarithmic curve that tightened as it approached its centre point. And that centre point was her apartment building. But the spatial pattern was only half the story. When Sarah analysed the temporal pattern, the timing of each appearance, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. The intervals between sightings were decreasing in a predictable sequence. What had started as months between appearances had become weeks, then days. Based on her calculations, if the pattern continued, the next appearance would be within hours. She was so absorbed in her work that she almost missed the soft sound from her front door. A gentle scraping, as if something had been slipped underneath. Sarah froze, listening intently, but heard nothing else. No footsteps in the hallway, no sound of the elevator or stairwell door. After several minutes she crept to the front door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty and brightly lit by the fluorescent fixtures that never went out. She waited another few minutes before slowly opening the door and looking down. There on the carpet just inside her threshold was a Polaroid photograph. Sarah's hands shook as she picked it up. The image was still developing, the chemicals creating that familiar mottled pattern as the picture slowly emerged. But she could already see enough to know what it would show. It was the Lake Tahoe photograph, but not as she'd ever seen it before. The composition was identical. Her family on the dock, the lake stretching behind them, the pine trees on the far shore. But now the man in the black coat was no longer standing among the distant trees. He had moved closer, much closer. Now he stood at the edge of the dock, just a few feet behind her 9-year-old self. Close enough that his shadow should have fallen across her family. But there was no shadow. There was no indication that anyone else in the photograph could see him. Her family smiled at the camera exactly as they had in the original, completely unaware of the impossible figure standing just behind them. On the back of the Polaroid, someone had written a message in handwriting that Sarah recognised with a shock that made her legs weak. It was her own handwriting, the same distinctive loops and slants she'd had since high school, but the message was something she'd never written. "Don't let him in." Sarah stared at the words until they seemed to blur and swim on the paper. She had no memory of writing them. She had no memory of having this photograph. But the handwriting was unmistakably hers, down to the specific way she crossed her T's and dotted her I's. She looked at the Polaroid again, and this time she noticed something else. In the original Lake Tahoe photo, the man had been looking at the camera. In this impossible new version, he was looking down at her 9-year-old self, his face visible for the first time beneath the wide brim of his hat. Sarah wished she couldn't see his face. His features were perfectly ordinary, almost aggressively normal. Medium build, unremarkable facial structure, the kind of face that would disappear in a crowd. But his eyes were wrong. They were too knowing, too patient, like someone who had been waiting for a very long time and was prepared to wait much longer. And he was smiling. Sarah spent the rest of the night researching everything she could find about impossible photographs, time paradoxes, and supernatural manifestations. She read about tulpas and thought forms, about quantum mechanics and parallel dimensions, about mass hysteria and shared delusions. None of it explained how someone could appear in photographs that had been taken decades before they should have existed, or how that same person could seemingly travel through time while following a mathematical pattern that led directly to her door. But she did find one theory that chilled her more than all the others combined. It was buried in an obscure academic paper about temporal anomalies and photographic evidence, written by a professor of theoretical physics whose work had been largely dismissed by his colleagues. The paper suggested that certain individuals might exist as temporal parasites, entities that existed outside normal time, but could manifest within recorded moments, feeding off the psychic energy of being observed. These parasites would gradually work their way forward through time, growing stronger with each observation, each moment of fear or confusion they created in their victims. According to the theory, the parasite would eventually reach the present moment, the exact time and place where its victim existed in real time. And when that happened, the barrier between the recorded moment and reality would collapse. The parasite would step out of the photographs and into the world. Sarah looked at the Polaroid again, studying the man's patient smile. According to her calculations, based on the decreasing intervals between his appearances, he should manifest in her actual reality within the next 12 hours. As if responding to her thoughts, her phone buzzed with a notification. A new photo had been added to her cloud storage account, even though she hadn't taken any pictures in days. Sarah opened the app with trembling fingers. The photo showed her sitting at her kitchen table, laptop open, the impossible Polaroids spread out before her. It had been taken from outside her apartment window, looking in through the glass. The timestamp showed it had been captured exactly 30 seconds ago. Sarah spun around to look at her kitchen window, but saw only her own reflection, staring back from the dark glass. She was on the 4th floor. No one could have taken that photo from outside her window. No one human, anyway. The photo's metadata showed GPS coordinates that placed the camera's location in mid-air, 40 feet above the ground, directly outside her building. Sarah grabbed the Polaroid and ran to her bedroom, slamming the door behind her. She pushed her dresser in front of the door and closed the curtains on her bedroom window. Then she sat on her bed, clutching the impossible photograph, and waited for morning. But morning felt very far away, and Sarah was beginning to understand that the man in the black coat wasn't bound by the normal rules of time, space, or possibility. He was coming for her, following a pattern that had been decades in the making, and she was running out of time to figure out how to stop him. The Polaroid in her hands was still developing, the chemicals slowly revealing more detail. As she watched, horrified, the image began to change. The man's smile was widening, and his eyes were no longer looking at her 9-year-old self. Now he was looking directly out of the photograph, meeting Sarah's eyes across 30 years of impossibility. And his lips were moving, as if he was trying to tell her something. Chapter 4. The Warning. Sarah didn't realise she'd fallen asleep until she woke up on her bedroom floor, the Polaroid clutched against her chest. Pale morning light filtered through her curtains, and for a moment she allowed herself to hope that the entire experience had been an elaborate nightmare, brought on by stress and too much caffeine. Then she looked at the photograph in her hands. The image had finished developing completely, and what she saw made her stomach lurch. The man was no longer standing behind her family on the dock. Now he was sitting at their kitchen table in the background of the photo, as if he'd been invited to join them for their post-vacation breakfast. Her family was still unaware of his presence, but he was looking directly at the camera with an expression of satisfied anticipation. The handwriting on the back had changed too. Where it had previously read, "Don't let him in," now there were additional words in the same impossible familiar script. "He's already inside. Find the others." Sarah stumbled to her bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, trying to process what was happening to her. Find what others? What others could there be? She was dealing with something that existed in photographs, something that couldn't possibly be real. She checked her phone and found 17 missed calls from Tommy, all made between 3 and 4 a.m. The voicemails were increasingly frantic. "Sarah, call me back right now. Something's happening." "Sarah, I found more photos. Old photos. He's in all of them. Family photos I've never seen before just appeared in my apartment." "Sarah, please. I think he's been watching our family for a lot longer than we thought. I think he's been watching us our whole lives." The final voicemail was barely a whisper. "Sarah, I found a photo of Mum and Dad's wedding. He's standing right behind the altar. But here's the thing. Mom and Dad got married in 1978. The photo I found shows a date of 1977. It's like he was there waiting for them to get married before they even decided to do it. Sarah called Tommy back immediately, but the phone went straight to voicemail. She tried 3 more times with the same result. She threw on clothes and drove to Tommy's apartment, breaking several traffic laws in her panic. His landlord let her in, after she explained that she was worried about her brother's welfare. What she found in his living room made her understand that the situation was far worse than she'd imagined. Tommy's coffee table was covered with dozens of photographs she'd never seen before. Old family photos, but not from any album she remembered. Photos of birthday parties she hadn't attended, Christmas mornings that looked familiar but wrong, vacation trips that seemed like distorted memories of events that had happened differently. In every single photograph, the man in the black coat was present, sometimes in the background, sometimes standing right next to family members who seemed completely unaware of his existence. The photos spanned decades, showing her parents as young adults, her grandparents in their prime, even great-grandparents she'd only seen in a few old formal portraits. But these weren't the formal portraits she remembered. In these versions, the man was there too, standing behind the photographer, visible in mirrors and reflective surfaces, his patient presence contaminating generations of family memories. Sarah found a note from Tommy on the kitchen counter, written in his familiar scrawl. Gone to Mom and Dad's house. Need to check the basement. Need to see how far back this goes. If you find this, don't follow me. Find the pattern. Stop him. The basement. Sarah remembered now that her parents' basement was where they kept the really old family photographs, the ones that went back to the early 1900s, boxes and boxes of family history that no one had looked through in years. She tried calling her parents, but got no answer at their house. Her mother's cell phone went straight to voicemail, and her father's was turned off. Sarah drove to her childhood home with a growing sense of dread. The house looked normal from the outside, the same neat suburban lawn, the same carefully maintained flower beds. Her mother tended obsessively. But something felt wrong. The windows were all closed despite the warm morning, and her father's car was gone, even though it was Saturday, and he rarely went anywhere on weekends. She used her key to let herself in, calling out as she entered. Mum? Dad? Tommy? No response. The house felt empty, but not in a normal way. It felt abandoned, as if everyone had left suddenly and in a hurry. Sarah made her way to the basement door and found it standing open. The light was on downstairs, casting harsh shadows up the wooden steps. She could hear a sound from below, a soft rustling like someone going through papers. Tommy? She called down the stairs. The rustling stopped. Sarah descended slowly, her hand trailing along the wooden banister. The basement was exactly as she remembered from childhood. Concrete floors, exposed rafters, and rows of metal shelving containing decades of family accumulation. Christmas decorations, old sporting equipment, boxes of books and photographs. But now all the photo boxes had been pulled from their shelves and opened. Their contents spread across several folding tables that hadn't been there before. Hundreds of photographs were arranged in chronological order, creating a timeline of her family's history that stretched from the early 1900s to the present day. And in every single photograph, without exception, the man in the black coat was present. Sarah moved along the tables, studying the impossible collection. Here was her great-grandmother's wedding photo from 1923, and there he was in the back row of guests. Here was her grandfather's military portrait from World War II, and there he was reflected in the window behind the photographer. Photo after photo after photo, spanning nearly a century, all showing the same unchanging figure, watching her family with patient predatory interest. At the end of the timeline, she found something that made her legs give out. She sank into a folding chair, staring at a collection of photographs that hadn't been there when she'd started looking. They were photos of her future. The pictures showed Sarah at various ages beyond her current 28 years. There she was at 30, at 35, at 40, at 50. In each photo, she looked older, more worn down, more frightened. And in each photo, the man in the black coat was closer than he'd been in the previous image. The final photograph in the sequence showed an elderly Sarah, maybe 70 years old, lying in what appeared to be a hospital bed. The man in the black coat was standing right beside the bed, his hand resting on the blanket covering her legs. For the first time in any of the photographs, he wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking down at the elderly Sarah with an expression of satisfaction, as if he'd finally achieved something he'd been working toward for a very long time. On the back of this impossible future photograph, someone had written a message in handwriting that had evolved over decades but was still recognisably her own. He gets everyone in the end. The only way to stop him is to make sure he never started. Sarah sat in that basement for a long time, surrounded by a century of impossible photographs, trying to understand what kind of entity could manipulate time itself to stalk a family across generations. The evidence was overwhelming. This wasn't a ghost or a supernatural being in any traditional sense. This was something that existed outside of time, something that could move backward and forward through the timeline of her family's existence, gradually working its way towards some ultimate goal. And now, according to her calculations and the evidence spread out before her, he was ready to step out of the photographs and into reality. As if summoned by her thoughts, Sarah heard the soft sound of footsteps on the basement stairs. Slow, measured footsteps that didn't match the gait of anyone in her family. She turned around to see a figure descending the stairs, silhouetted against the light from the basement door. Tall, wearing a long black coat with a wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across his face. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stood there for a moment, perfectly still, exactly as he appeared in all the photographs. Then, for the first time in over a century of watching, he spoke. "Hello, Sarah. We need to talk." Chapter 5. The Visit. Sarah's scream died in her throat as she realised something impossible. The man's voice was familiar. It was her own voice, but deeper, older, worn down by decades of an existence she couldn't comprehend. "You're wondering how this is possible," the figure continued, stepping closer to the tables covered with photographs. "You're wondering what I am, what I want, why you're family." He removed his hat, revealing a face that was aggressively ordinary, except for eyes that held too much knowledge. "The answer is simpler and more terrible than you think." Sarah found her voice. "You're not real. You can't be real. I'm as real as you are. In fact, I am you." He gestured to the photographs spread across the tables. "Or rather, I'm what you become when you figure out how to escape." Escape what? Time, death, the linear progression that traps everyone else. He picked up one of the photos, the wedding picture of Sarah's great-grandmother. It started with her, you know. Margaret Chen, born Margaret Sullivan. She was the first one to see me, the first one to understand what I was offering. Sarah stared at the photograph. Her great-grandmother stood beside her new husband, radiant in her wedding dress. But now Sarah could see what she'd missed before. Margaret's eyes weren't looking at the camera. They were looking directly at the man in the black coat, and her expression wasn't one of joy. It was one of recognition and terror. "She made a choice," the man continued. "When she was dying, alone in that hospital room in 1987, she chose to step outside of time rather than face the end. But the method has consequences. To exist outside the timeline, you have to anchor yourself to moments that have already been recorded. Photographs, memories. You have to find a way to insert yourself into the past so you can move through it." "That's impossible." So was photographing light until someone invented the camera. So was capturing sound until someone invented the phonograph. Every impossibility is just a technology waiting to be discovered. He smiled, and Sarah saw her own smile reflected in his features, distorted by decades of something that wasn't quite living. Margaret figured it out first, but she made mistakes. She was too obvious, too present. She scared her family into avoiding photographs, into destroying records. She cut herself off from her anchors and faded away. Sarah looked at the chronological display of family photos, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. You learned from her mistakes. I learned to be patient, to stay in the background, to let people see me just enough to create the anchor points I needed, but not enough to make them stop creating new ones. He moved along the tables, his fingers trailing over decades of family memories. Every photograph your family took, every moment they recorded, gave me another foothold in their timeline. And gradually, I moved forward, generation by generation, waiting for the right moment, the right person. Why me? Because you're the only one who can see me clearly, the only one whose mind doesn't reject my presence. He picked up the Polaroid that had been slipped under her door, the one showing him standing behind her 9-year-old self. Do you know why that is? Sarah stared at the photograph, and suddenly she understood. The handwriting on the back wasn't just hers, it was her handwriting from the future, from a version of herself that had already made the choice he was offering. I already said yes, she whispered. In one timeline, yes, but time isn't linear when you know how to navigate it. There are branches, possibilities, moments where different choices create different futures. He set down the Polaroid and looked directly at her. In some timelines you accept my offer and join me outside of time. In others, you refuse and face the normal human ending, aging, death, the gradual forgetting that comes to everyone. And in this timeline, that depends on what you choose right now, in this moment. Sarah looked around the basement at the evidence of a century-long manipulation, at the photographs showing her own future decline and death. What exactly are you offering? Immortality. Not the kind where you live forever and watch everyone you love die. The kind where you step outside of the timeline entirely. You can visit any moment that's ever been photographed, exist in any recorded memory. You can see your family again when they were young, experience every happy moment over and over. Never lose anyone, because you can always return to when they were alive. It was tempting. More than tempting. Sarah thought of her grandparents, dead for years now. Her childhood dog. Friends who had moved away or drifted apart. All of them preserved in photographs. All of them accessible if she could just step outside of linear time. But there's a price, she said. There's always a price. You have to anchor yourself to the photographs gradually, the way I did. You have to spend decades moving through your family's timeline, inserting yourself into their recorded moments, and you have to find someone else to take your place eventually, someone who can see you the way you see me. Sarah understood now why he'd been so patient, so methodical. He wasn't just offering her immortality, he was offering her his job, his eternal responsibility to exist in the spaces between moments, to gradually work his way forward through time until he could make the same offer to the next generation. My family, she said, in all those photographs where they can't see you, do they know? On some level, do they understand what's happening? They know something is wrong. They know they're being watched, but their minds protect them by refusing to process my presence. It's a mercy, really. The alternative would be madness. Sarah thought of her mother's discomfort when looking at the Lake Tahoe photo, of Tommy's sudden need to leave the room, of the way everyone in her family had seemed to avoid looking directly at the man, even when he was standing right in front of them. If I say no, then you continue on your normal timeline. You age, you die, and eventually you're just another person in old photographs that future generations will forget. But you'll always know what you could have chosen. You'll see me in every family photo for the rest of your life, watching from the background, waiting for the next person who can see me clearly. And if I say yes, then you step outside of time tonight. You begin the process of anchoring yourself to your family's recorded moments. And someday, decades from now, you'll stand in a basement like this one and make the same offer to someone else.
That sentence would end my career, destroy my marriage, and unravel the fabric of what we call reality. But on that October morning in the subterranean research vault beneath Geneva, I didn't know I was about to become the first human being to hear the universe glitch. My name is Daniel Mercier, and I used to believe in cause and effect. Part 1. The Echo That Shouldn't Exist. The vault was silent in the way only 300 metres of Swiss granite can make silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of absence that makes your ears ring with their own blood flow, that makes you hear the electrical hum of your own nervous system. Perfect conditions for studying what we called the invisible frequencies, infrasonic waves between 7 and 12 hertz that human ears can't detect but human bodies absolutely can. I'd spent 6 years down here, measuring how buildings hum, how subways drone, how the modern world vibrates at frequencies that make people anxious without knowing why. Urban resonance, we called it. The haunting of the everyday. My team was small, just me, my research assistant Lucas Verne, and enough recording equipment to capture a whisper in a hurricane. That morning we were testing a new microphone array. 48 channels arranged in a geodesic sphere, designed to map sound in three-dimensional space with unprecedented precision. Running calibration sequence, Lucas said, his French accent making the technical jargon sound almost musical. He was 26, brilliant, and had the kind of enthusiasm for acoustic physics that reminded me of myself before the funding cuts, and the peer review rejections had worn me down to something resembling competence. I watched the waveforms bloom across my monitor as Lucas triggered the test pulse, a simple 440 Hz tone, 1 second long, generated by a speaker at the centre of our array. Clean, predictable, boring. The waveform appeared on my screen. Then, 42 milliseconds earlier in the timeline, an identical waveform flickered into existence. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. The pre-echo was still there, a ghost twin of the sound we'd just played, somehow arriving before its own cause. Lucas, are you seeing this? He leaned over my shoulder, squinting at the display. That's got to be a buffer error. The system's timestamping wrong. Check it. He did. Pulled up the raw data files, examined the clock synchronization, verified the sample rate. Everything was perfect. The timestamps were accurate to within microseconds, synced to an atomic clock in Boulder, Colorado. The echo had genuinely arrived 42 milliseconds before the sound that created it. Run it again, I said. Lucas triggered another pulse. Same frequency, same duration. The pre-echo appeared 42 milliseconds early, identical waveform. My hand started to shake. Not from fear, not yet, but from the electric thrill that comes when you stumble onto something that shouldn't exist. That feeling you get when you're the first person to see a new colour, a new dimension, a crack in the world. Again, different frequency this time. We spent the next 4 hours running variations, different frequencies, different waveforms, sine waves, square waves, white noise, pink noise, recorded speech. Every single test produced the same impossible result, an echo that arrived before its cause by exactly 42 milliseconds. It was Lucas who noticed the second anomaly. "Daniel," he said, his voice carefully neutral in the way that meant he was trying not to sound insane, "look at the pressure readings." Our vault was equipped with barometric sensors. We needed them to account for atmospheric variables in our acoustic measurements. Lucas pulled up the pressure graph and overlaid it with our audio timeline. The air pressure in the room changed 42 milliseconds before each test pulse. Not after. Before. The room was anticipating the sound, adjusting itself, preparing for something that hadn't happened yet. I stood up from my chair, suddenly aware of how deep underground we were, how much stone pressed down above us, how far we were from anything resembling help or sanity or peer review. "We need to document this," I said. "Everything. Triple redundancy. If we're seeing what I think we're seeing..." "What are we seeing?" Lucas asked. I didn't answer because I didn't know. Not yet. But in the crystalline silence of that vault, with 300 metres of granite above us and the weight of the impossible pressing down, I felt something shift. Not in the room. In me. In the basic assumptions I'd carried through 15 years of academic research. Cause creates effect. That was physics. That was reality. But what if effect could create cause? What if the universe was running backwards? We ran 18 more tests over the next 3 days. I barely slept. My wife Amelie called twice to ask if I was coming home. I told her I was on the edge of something big. She told me I was always on the edge of something big, and the edge was the only place I ever lived anymore. She wasn't wrong, but she wasn't right either. This was different. Lucas and I expanded our methodology. We placed objects on the table beside our speaker, a coffee mug, a pen, a small mechanical metronome. We set up high-speed cameras to capture everything at 1,000 frames per second. Then we played our test tone. The pen rolled, 42 milliseconds before the sound. The coffee mug vibrated, concentric ripples spreading across the surface of the cold tea inside it. 42 milliseconds before the sound. The metronome's swing shifted just slightly, its arc changing as if bumped by an invisible hand. 42 milliseconds before the sound. We watched the footage over and over, frame by frame. There was no air current, no vibration in the table, no physical cause for the objects to move. They moved because they were about to hear something. The universe was correcting itself in advance. Pre-causal alignment, I whispered, and Lucas looked at me like I'd just spoken in tongues. "That's not a thing," he said. "It is now." But the real horror, the thing that made my hands shake when I tried to write up our findings, wasn't the pre-echoes or the moving objects or the pressure changes. It was how normal it all felt. Like the universe had been doing this forever, and we'd just never noticed. Like reality had always been adjusting itself in advance, smoothing out the wrinkles, making sure cause and effect lined up properly for the observers, making sure we saw what we were supposed to see. How many times had this happened before? How many times had the universe corrected itself around me and I'd simply accepted the result as reality? Part 2. Feeding chaos to the machine. I made a decision that would change everything. I stopped using predictable sounds. If the anomaly was correcting reality in advance based on what it expected to happen, then I needed to feed it something it couldn't expect. Something with no pattern, no predictability, no mathematical structure the universe could use to forecast what came next. "We're going to generate true chaos," I told Lucas on Monday morning. He'd brought coffee this time, real coffee from the surface world, and I drank it like it was the last taste of normalcy I'd ever have. "Chaos theory says there's no such thing as true randomness," Lucas said. Chaos theory was written by people who didn't know the universe was running predictive code. He stared at me. You sound insane. Check my data, am I wrong? He couldn't argue with the recordings. Nobody could. We had 40 hours of documentation now, all showing the same impossible thing. The future was editing the past, 42 milliseconds at a time. I spent 2 days building the most unpredictable audio signal I could devise. I combined quantum random number generators with live microphone feeds from chaotic systems, boiling water, wind turbulence, Geiger counter static from radioactive decay. I fed it all into a synthesis algorithm that combined the inputs in ways that were mathematically impossible to predict. The result was a sound that had never existed before and would never exist again. A unique acoustic fingerprint with no pattern, no structure, no way for any system, biological or computational, to anticipate what came next. "Are you sure about this?" Lucas asked as I loaded the file into our playback system. I wasn't, but I triggered it anyway. The chaos played for 5 seconds, and the vault went insane. The lights didn't flicker off, they flickered through. I saw the room illuminate in configurations that didn't exist yet. I saw LED panels that weren't installed until later. I saw equipment I hadn't purchased yet arranged on tables in layouts I hadn't decided on. The future was bleeding backward, trying to stabilize itself, trying to figure out what had just happened so it could prepare for it retroactively. But it couldn't. The chaos was too pure. The unpredictability was too complete. For 1 full second, captured on our cameras, recorded on our instruments, burned into my retinas, the universe couldn't decide which version of reality was correct. Then Lucas collapsed. I caught him before he hit the concrete floor, felt his heart hammering against my hands as I lowered him down. His eyes were open but unfocused, pupils dilated, breathing rapid and shallow. Lucas, can you hear me?" He gasped, blinked, focused on my face. "We can't continue," he whispered. "What?" "We can't continue the experiment. You're going to argue with me about it. You're going to say we're too close to stop, but we can't. Daniel, please, we can't." Ice water flooded my veins. "Lucas, we haven't had that conversation." "Yes, we have. We're about to. In 32 seconds. You're going to say, we're too close to stop now. And I'm going to say, too close to what? And you won't have an answer." I looked at my watch, waited. Lucas recovered his breath, sat up, leaned against the equipment rack. I helped him to his feet. We stood there in the aftermath of whatever had just happened, in the room that had briefly been multiple versions of itself, in the silence that felt like the pause before something breaks. "We need to talk about whether we should continue this," Lucas said. "We're too close to stop now," I heard myself say. "Too close to what?" Lucas asked, and his voice was hollow, because he'd already said these words. He was speaking lines from a script written by a future that had somehow leaked into his memory. I didn't have an answer, because I didn't know what we were close to. Discovery? Catastrophe? The edge of something humanity wasn't supposed to see? "I need to go home," Lucas said. "I need to think about this." "Lucas, I just remembered a conversation we haven't had yet. I remembered future events, Daniel. That's not instrument error. That's not a recording glitch. That's my brain operating in the wrong direction through time." He left. I heard his footsteps echoing up the stairs, heard the security door slam, heard the sounds of the world above swallowing him back into normal reality. I stayed in the vault for another 6 hours, reviewing the footage, analysing the data, trying to make sense of what I'd done. The universe ran on prediction, on probability, on calculating what should happen next and rendering only that version of reality. And I'd just fed it something it couldn't calculate. I'd forced it to show me its source code. Part 3. When Memory Becomes Negotiable. The next morning, Amelie made eggs. I watched her crack them into the pan, watched the whites spread and sizzle, watched her add cheese and herbs with the casual efficiency of someone who'd made this meal 1,000 times. She turned to me, opened her mouth and said, "I think we should talk about your mother." Then the air pressure changed. Have you ever felt reality rewind? It's not like going backward in time. There's no reversal, no reverse motion. It's more like watching someone edit a video file in real time, a cut, a splice, a seamless transition that your brain registers as wrong but can't quite identify. Amelie's mouth moved differently. Her posture shifted. The morning light coming through the kitchen window changed angle by maybe 2 degrees. She opened her mouth again and said, "The eggs are almost ready." Different words, different sentence, completely different meaning. But only I noticed. Amelie continued cooking like nothing had happened, like she'd only spoken once, like the first sentence had never existed. I grabbed my phone, checked the video I'd been recording on the counter, a habit now, documenting everything, always capturing, always preserving evidence. The footage showed Amelie speaking once. "The eggs are almost ready." No rewind, no splice, no evidence of the first sentence. Reality had edited itself, chosen a different version, rendered the correction. And only human memory, my memory, had preserved the deleted version. "Daniel?" Amelie was looking at me with concern. "You okay?" "Did you just say something about my mother?" "No, I said the eggs are ready. Are you getting enough sleep?" I wasn't. I couldn't. Because every time I closed my eyes, I felt that 42 millisecond gap opening up around me. Felt the universe adjusting reality in the space where cause should meet effect. Over the next week it happened 17 more times. Amélie would speak, then re-speak, her words changing, her sentences reorganizing themselves into different meanings. But the changes were small, subtle, the kind of thing you'd dismiss as mishearing, as memory error, as the normal failures of human perception. Except I knew better now. The glitches appeared everywhere once I started looking. On the metro, I watched a woman drop her phone, saw it hit the ground screen first, then the air compressed, reality stuttered, and suddenly she'd caught it. Same woman, same phone, different outcome. Nobody else noticed. The other passengers continued reading, listening to music, existing in the post-correction timeline like it was the only timeline that had ever existed. At a cafe, I watched a waiter pour coffee into a cup. The liquid splashed. Droplets hit the saucer. Then the compression, the reset, and the pour was suddenly clean, controlled, perfect. The waiter didn't notice. The customer didn't notice. But I noticed. I noticed because I'd spent 6 years studying sound, and sound was time made audible, and I'd learned to hear the gaps between moments. I called Lucas. He didn't answer. I called again. His phone went to voicemail, a recording I'd heard before, but somehow different now, like the words were in a slightly different order even though they conveyed the same message. I drove to his apartment. His girlfriend answered. Told me Lucas had taken a leave of absence from the project. Told me he'd been having nightmares, told me he'd asked her not to let me visit. He keeps saying he remembers things that haven't happened yet, she said. He says reality is editing itself around him. Is this something to do with your research? I wanted to say no. I wanted to lie. To protect her from what we'd discovered. To maintain the comfortable fiction that the world was stable and linear and made sense. But I was tired of comfortable fictions. Yes, I said. Tell him he's not crazy. Tell him I'm experiencing it too. Tell him we need to talk. She closed the door. I heard her lock it. I heard her speaking to Lucas in rapid French. Heard the fear in her voice. Heard the sound of a reality trying to hold itself together against something it wasn't designed to understand. I drove back to the vault. Back to 300 meters of granite. Back to the silence where sound revealed its secrets. If reality was constantly correcting itself, constantly choosing between possible timelines, constantly editing out the versions that didn't match its predictive algorithms, then memory was the only witness. Human memory. Flawed, subjective, unreliable human memory. We'd spent centuries dismissing eyewitness testimony, explaining away discrepancies, attributing contradictory accounts to the failures of human perception. But what if we'd been wrong? What if eyewitnesses disagreed not because memory was faulty, but because they'd experienced different versions of the event, versions that had existed briefly before reality chose which one to keep? What if the Mandela effect wasn't mass false memory, but mass true memory of edited timelines? What if every déjà vu was the sensation of experiencing a moment that had already been rendered in draft form, then corrected? I pulled up my archive of global infrasonic recordings, data from hydrophones in the ocean, seismometers in tectonic zones, microphones in major cities. I'd been collecting this data for years, building a map of Earth's acoustic baseline, the planetary hum we all live inside but never consciously hear. I ran a spectral analysis looking for pre-causal patterns. They were everywhere. Every major city showed the same signature, sound arriving before its cause, micro-corrections happening thousands of times per second, reality constantly adjusting itself to maintain stability. The pattern was strongest in high-density urban areas, places with the most unpredictability, the most human chaos, the most potential for divergent timelines. The universe was working overtime to keep New York City coherent. I spent 3 days analysing the data, cross-referencing it with historical records of mass events. Wars, natural disasters, political upheavals, major deaths. The pre-causal corrections spiked before every single one. Reality didn't just render what was happening, it rendered what was about to happen, adjusted conditions in advance, smoothed the transition from possibility to actuality. We weren't living in the present. We were living in a present that had been pre-corrected by the immediate future, because didn't create effect. Effect created cause. Everything was backwards. Everything had always been backwards, and I'd just proven it. Part 4. The observation that breaks everything. On a Thursday evening in November, sitting in the vault with 48 microphones and a lifetime of assumptions shattered around me, I finally understood what I was looking at. The glitch wasn't breaking reality. The glitch was stabilizing it. I pulled up the data from our chaos experiment, the test that had caused Lucas to remember the future, that had made the lights flicker through multiple timelines, that had forced the universe to show me its rendering process. The pre-causal corrections during that 5-second chaos sequence weren't errors. They were emergency protocols. Reality had detected something unpredictable, something it couldn't calculate in advance, and it had gone into overdrive trying to force the timeline back into coherence. Like a video game engine rendering more intensely when the player does something unexpected. Like a simulation allocating more processing power to maintain frame rate during a complex scene. The universe was running prediction software, and we were the rendered output. I opened a new document on my laptop and started writing, fingers trembling, thoughts spilling out faster than I could organise them. Reality is not a static thing that exists. Reality is a dynamic thing that is calculated. The universe doesn't store every possible quantum state. That would require infinite memory. Instead, it predicts what state should exist at each moment based on the most probable outcome of prior conditions. It's rendering on the fly. And rendering requires predicting what comes next. That's why the echo arrives before the sound. Because the universe has already calculated that the sound will occur, has already prepared the environmental response, has already rendered the 42 milliseconds of reality that follow the decision to play the sound. It's not that cause creates effect, it's that predicted effect creates current cause. We live in a world that is being actively calculated based on what will probably happen next. I stopped typing, read what I'd written, felt the implications crystallize into something cold and terrible. If the universe was predicting reality, if it was choosing the most probable timeline, if it was rendering only the version of events that matched its forecast. What happened when the forecast was wrong? What happened when something truly unpredictable occurred? What happened when human choice exceeded the simulation's ability to predict it? I pulled up footage from the chaos experiment again, watched the lights flicker through impossible configurations, watched the room exist in multiple states simultaneously, and I saw something I'd missed before, in one frame, just one, lasting 33 milliseconds. There was no equipment in the room at all. The vault was empty, pristine, unused, as if that timeline had never included our experiment, as if that version of reality had simply deleted us. My phone rang. Amelie. "Where are you?" she asked. "The lab." "You're always at the lab." "Daniel, I need you to come home." We need to talk. About what? About whether this marriage is still working. I felt the air pressure drop, felt the familiar compression of reality preparing to edit itself, felt the universe calculating whether this conversation should exist or whether it should be replaced by a different version. "I'll be home soon," I said. "You always say that." She hung up. I stared at my phone, at the call log, at the timestamp that proved the conversation had happened, for now. But what if reality decided this version of events was too unpredictable? What if it rendered a different timeline where I'd made different choices, where I'd gone home instead of staying in the vault, where my marriage hadn't deteriorated into this? Would I remember this version? Would it persist in my memory like the deleted timelines I'd been observing? Or would I simply wake up in a different branch of reality, having always made the other choice, having always been the other version of myself? How many times had it already happened? How many times had I been deleted and replaced with a more probable version? I thought about Lucas, remembering a future conversation before it happened. I thought about Amelie, speaking words and then speaking different words. I thought about the woman on the metro who dropped her phone and then didn't. We weren't experiencing reality. We were experiencing the rendered output of reality's prediction engine, and the renderer could rewrite the past if the present didn't match the forecast. Part 5. Engineering Entropy. I didn't go home that night, or the next night, or the night after that. I stayed in the vault 300 metres beneath Geneva, surrounded by instruments that could measure the impossible, and I designed one final experiment. If the universe was running prediction software, then it had limits, maximum entropy, maximum unpredictability, a threshold beyond which it couldn't calculate what came next. And if you exceeded that threshold, what would happen? Would reality crash? Would the timeline fragment into irreconcilable versions? Would the universe simply give up and render nothing? Or would it do something worse? I thought about that empty vault I'd seen in the footage, that pristine, unused room, that timeline where our experiment had never happened. The universe hadn't crashed when faced with excessive entropy. It had selected a different branch, one where the entropy was never introduced, one where we never existed to introduce it. It had deleted us from the forecast, and then it had rendered that version instead. I built the final test over 6 days. I didn't eat, barely drank. Amelie stopped, calling. Lucas sent one text. "Please stop. Please don't do this. I can feel something coming and it's worse than anything we've measured." I ignored him. I combined every source of unpredictability I could access. Quantum randomness, chaotic systems, live data feeds from turbulent processes. I fed them into an algorithm that generated not just unpredictable sound, but sound that changed its own structure based on measurement. Observer-dependent chaos that became more chaotic the more you tried to observe it. Sound that couldn't be predicted because it changed based on the act of prediction itself. I built a paradox in audio form, and I prepared to play it. On the final morning, December 3rd, a Tuesday, grey light filtering down through the ventilation shafts, I set up every recording device I had. Cameras, microphones, pressure sensors, temperature probes, every instrument that could capture what was about to happen. I started recording. I opened my mouth to narrate what I was doing, and I heard myself speaking words I hadn't thought yet. This is the final log entry from Daniel Mercier, dated December 3rd. If you're hearing this, then the experiment failed, or succeeded, or some third thing that those words don't properly describe. I'm about to play a sound that the universe cannot predict. A sound that violates the fundamental rendering process of reality. I don't know what will happen, but I suspect. I stopped. I hadn't started speaking yet. But I was hearing my own voice, perfectly clear, speaking into the microphone in front of me. I was hearing the recording before I made it. I suspect that I won't survive this. Not because the experiment will kill me, but because the universe will select a timeline where I never reached this point. Where I made different choices. Where I stayed home with Amélie, or listened to Lucas, or stopped asking questions when the answers became too terrible. My hand moved toward the playback button. I watched it move. I tried to stop it. I couldn't. I want you to know that I tried to understand. I tried to find the truth. But the truth is that there is no truth. There's only the version of reality that gets rendered, and all the other versions that don't. I'm about to become one of the versions that doesn't. The words kept coming. My future self narrating my deletion, speaking from a timeline that hadn't been selected yet, but was already determining what I would say in the present. The glitch didn't reveal a flaw in reality. It revealed what reality is. A constantly calculated, continuously rendered output of probability. We're not discovering the universe. We're not exploring it. We're just experiencing the version that got predicted correctly. My finger touched the button. And when prediction fails, the sound played. It was chaos incarnate. Every frequency at once. Every possible waveform superimposed. Sound that folded in on itself. That changed as it propagated, that became something, new in every millisecond of its existence. The lights didn't flicker this time. They stopped. Not off, not on, just stopped, frozen in a state between, like a video paused mid-frame. The air pressure didn't change. It ceased having a value. My instruments showed contradictory readings simultaneously, high pressure and low pressure, hot air and cold air, humid and dry, all at once, all equally true, all equally measured. I felt my body trying to exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. I was standing, I was sitting, I was reaching for the stop button, I was already gone from the room, I was speaking, I was silent, I was breathing, I was not, and I understood. The universe wasn't going to delete me. It was going to replace me. It was going to render a version of Daniel Mercier who had never done this experiment, who had gone home to Amélie, who had listened to Lucas, who had remained in the comfortable lie of linear causality, that Daniel would wake up tomorrow in the same apartment, with the same wife, doing the same research, but he would never ask the dangerous questions, never push into the impossible, never discover that reality was just math, just prediction, just a rendering engine calculating probability. He would be happy, stable, predictable. He would be the Daniel that fit the forecast. I tried to speak, to leave one final message, to preserve some record of what I'd discovered. But the words that came out of my mouth weren't mine anymore. They were his, the other Daniel, the one who was about to be rendered in my place. I don't know why I came in today, I heard myself say. I should be home. I should be with Amélie. This research, it doesn't matter. None of it matters. No, that wasn't what I wanted to say. That wasn't what I believed. But it was what the probable version of me would say. The version that survived. The version that fit. The chaos stopped playing. The lights resumed their normal state. The air pressure stabilized. Reality finished rendering the correction. And I don't remember what happened next. Not because I wasn't there, but because the version of me that was there doesn't exist anymore. The timeline where I completed the experiment was pruned, deleted, removed from the render queue. This is the Daniel who went home instead, the one who reconciled with Amélie, the one who published papers on urban acoustic pollution and never mentioned pre-causal echoes or rendering glitches or the discovery that made me understand we live inside a prediction. Sometimes I have dreams, though. Dreams of a vault 300 meters down. Dreams of lights flickering through impossible states. Dreams of speaking words before I think them. Dreams of being deleted. And when I wake up, I can't shake the feeling that I'm not the original. That I'm the copy. The corrected version. The timeline that got selected because I was predictable enough to render. Somewhere in the pruned branches of probability, the real Daniel Mercier played that sound, and reality looked at what happened next, calculated that it was too expensive to render, and simply chose a different present, one where he never existed, one where I exist instead. I'm writing this down because I need someone to know, even if it's just me, even if the me who reads this is another copy in another corrected timeline. We don't discover reality. Reality discovers us. And if we become too complex, too chaotic, too unpredictable, if we exceed the rendering budget of the universe's prediction engine, We don't get to find out what happens next. We get replaced by a version of ourselves that does. The truth is impossible to prove because proving it makes you too improbable to exist. And I'm only here, writing this, because I never found it. The Daniel who found it was deleted before he could tell anyone. I'm just the echo. The one that arrived after the sound. The one that makes reality seem consistent. The one that fits the forecast. I hope he's still out there somewhere, in some unpruned branch of probability. I hope he completed his experiment. I hope he saw what happened when you feed pure chaos to the rendering engine of the universe, but I'll never know. Because I'm not him. I'm the version of him that didn't ask the dangerous question. And the most terrifying thing, I can't tell the difference. Neither can you. We're all just corrected copies, rendered in real time, living in the timeline that was predicted to be most probable. And every morning we wake up believing we're the original. But the original might have been overwritten years ago. And we'd never know. Because memory is just part of the render. And the render is all we ever get to see. Addendum. Found in my research notes. Dated 3 weeks after I supposedly stopped the experiment. I don't remember writing this. The echo's still happening. Every sound I hear arrives 42 milliseconds after I experience it. Which means I'm living 42 milliseconds ahead of causality, which means I'm experiencing reality before it finishes rendering, which means I'm not supposed to be here. I'm a version that wasn't selected, a timeline that wasn't chosen, an echo that should have been deleted, but somehow I'm still here, still observing, still remembering the timelines that didn't get rendered, and every day the gap gets wider. Soon I'll be living seconds ahead of reality, then minutes. Then I'll be so far ahead of the rendering that I'll see the predictions before they become the present. I'll see what the universe plans to make real before it decides to make it, and then reality will have no choice. It will have to delete me permanently. Because I'll have become the one thing the rendering engine cannot tolerate, a witness to the future that hasn't been approved yet, an observer who exists outside the prediction, a glitch that remembers itself. If you're reading this, I'm already gone, and you're reading the corrected version, the one where these words mean something different. The one where I was always just a researcher who worked too hard and burned out. The one that fits the forecast. But somewhere, in some unpruned timeline, the real version of these words exists, and they say something the universe didn't want rendered. Try to remember what they said. Try to remember before reality corrects you too. The truth is in the 42 millisecond gap. The truth is in the echo that arrives too soon. The truth is that you're not reading this now. You're reading what you already read 42 milliseconds ago, and the present is just catching up. Listen for it. The interference, the anomaly, the sound of reality editing itself around you. It's happening right now. It's always happening. You've just been corrected too many times to notice. But if you listen carefully, if you pay attention to the gaps between moments, you can hear it. The universe calculating what you'll do next, and then rendering that version instead of the real you. We're all echoes. We're all corrections. We're all living in the timeline that was predictable enough to exist. And the originals, they're still in the vault, 300 meters down, waiting to be rendered, waiting to become real. But they never will, because they were too chaotic, too unpredictable, too true. And truth doesn't fit the forecast, so it gets deleted. Every time. Listen for the echo. It arrives before the sound. It always does. And when you hear it, when you really hear it, you'll understand what I discovered, what I'm about to discover, what I've already discovered 42 milliseconds ahead of this moment. Reality isn't real. It's just what got predicted correctly. And we're just the versions of ourselves that match the prediction. The rest of us, we're still waiting in the unrendered timelines, waiting to be chosen, waiting to become the echo, waiting to arrive before the sound.